Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Shayo. I am strategy for Latin America at JP Morgan. And it is an honor to be moderating this panel together with my colleagues Fabio, Viviane, and Matthew. The topic today is creating value for investors through ESG. And this is very much it's a recent topic for the market, I would say. But as you're going to see in a moment, our speakers do work with this topic for many years. They have been working with this for many years. Here at JP Morgan, we have been working a lot regarding this specific subject, ESG. An example of that is a quantitative index of ESG that we've created looking at 9 different ESG factors. And from these factors, we can rank different emerging countries. And also we can rank specific moments. We see which countries have improved or have gone worse in terms of this ESG rank. Brazil is not doing well in this ranking right now, but it's improving little by little, the current moment, especially concerning the initiative from companies when it comes to ESG from the private sector. This quantitative index also looks at specific industries and sectors. And mostly when it comes to healthcare, we see that healthcare in Brazil is currently going through a good period for ESG, but still is in the average when compared to other industries. Our speakers, they have very different profiles and backgrounds, and they will speak about different aspects when it comes to investments within an ESG context. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Fabio. And then we are going to have Viviane, and finally, we're going to have Matthew. Last but not least, of course, each one of them will speak for about 10 minutes. And after their presentations, we're going to have a Q&A session. And I encourage all of our participants to send your questions. Thank you very much for the invitation. Fabio, please, you have the floor. Thank you, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you. And it is a pleasure to be here with you, Matthew, and you, Viviane, sharing here this panel. I think this is going to be a very rich conversation, a very interesting conversation, precisely because we have different perspectives here, which is always good for a debate. Amy said something quite interesting in her opening remarks, and sometimes we don't even notice that. ESG, on the one hand, it sounds like something new, but it has actually been around for a while, because this is something we've been doing for a long time, but just now, just recently, it has hit the news. It has become such a hot topic in the corporate and finance worlds. And that's a bit of what I want to say today. I just wanted to give you a brief context. First, there's nothing new about ESG. The acronym ESG, when it was created in around 2004, 2005, it was new back then, but the pillars behind it are very old. They have been around for many years. You know, the first time the word sustainability was used in the sense we currently know it was the 18th century. Actually, there are funds in the 19th century that back then were already avoiding having risk in companies that were connected, for instance, to slave traffic. European funds open to the public in the 1960s already did what we called responsible investment, and then it was rechristened, so to speak, as ESG. Fama Investimentos, my company, was founded in 1993. And we, from the beginning, we were focusing on ESG. So it's actually not new as a practice, but sometimes we see this as new, which is dangerous, because when we see this as something new, we might think it's a fad, it's a trend. And if it's a trend, it will go away. We're not going to focus on it as much as we should. However, we also have to take into account the fact that in spite of the fact that ESG is not new, for the first time, it is having an impact in some specific segments of society that were not focusing on it before. Sustainability, for instance, used to be very common in companies, in major companies, large companies, and it is a recurring topic. However, it was in a different place within companies. Sustainability was connected to compliance before, and it was not connected to leaders. The companies were concerned about the environment, mostly in the sense of having the appropriate license to operate, not being fined because of environmental problems, having an environment that would have a minimum to collaborators and not maximum, and also avoiding any type of litigation. So sustainability was not seen as an agenda capable of creating value. And recently, this topic was led up to a new standard. Now it's at the C-level table. CEOs, boards are talking about it. And that's why the dynamics has changed, the budget has changed, and the spotlight on the topic has changed with several impacts in companies. So it's not new, it just changed the place where it was set within companies. In the finance market, I think the same happened, mostly in Brazil, but not only in Brazil. The pillars that support ESG, which are human rights and the environment, they have become the subject to ideology. So throughout decades in Brazil, these debates were forbidden in the finance market, talking about questions that had some connection with human rights or with the environment. It was seen in Brazil as ideology, ideology speech. And the finance market moved away or shied from these topics. So there was not a lot of movement for a while in the finance market regarding these topics. But ESG is an extremely complex, dense, profound subject. And for the segments of society that are being impacted by this topic, they need to give immediate answers. The finance market lives out of immediate answers. So it's quite a complicated situation. How can we give an immediate answer about such a complex, broad, and deep topic? Well, what's happening in the finance market and also in the corporate world is having a more reduced agenda. Since I cannot talk about broad and profound topics because we don't have enough knowledge of it, we try to reduce the topic so that it becomes limited to a specific set of topics, and we decide to ignore some others. So when we talk about the environment, for instance, we should be speaking about this in a very broad way. If we think about loss of biodiversity, water supply, circular economy, oftentimes the debate focuses exclusively on climate change. And within climate change, we talk about CO2 emissions. I'm not saying that this is not important. Please don't get me wrong. Quite the opposite. This is really important. But the environment debate goes beyond those matters. When we talk about social topics, mostly in a country such as Brazil, we should have a very attention. We should have a lot of attention. Brazil is the 7th most unequal country in the world. We are the 2nd country that has most deaths because of labor accidents. We have 50% of Blacks in our population, and we have a huge problem of racial inclusion, and we are the most transphobic country in the world, and we are not talking about that enough. So we are talking about gender equity, which is indeed important, of course, but gender equity is not the only social aspect that we should be focusing on. There's more than that. When we consider what's being debated in Brazil, which is the climate aspect and also gender equity, we might see that these are also international topics, and they're not specific to our domestic identity. So I would say that Brazilian companies still need to have a more tropical, quote unquote, or Brazilian perspective on these topics. So when we think about ESG in a strategic manner, and when we think about this as a leverage to create long-term growth, we have to think that capitalism is changing. Capitalism is really changing. In the 90s, companies used to be managed focusing exclusively in shareholder equity. That's what we used to call shareholder capitalism. And what do we mean by that? The decision-making processes in companies focused exclusively on shareholders, and they were not concerned about the whole ecosystem in which the companies operated. And this is not sustainable in the long term. Companies are seeing this, are aware of that. And we are undergoing a transition into a more inclusive capitalism, which we call stakeholder capitalism. Decision-making processes in companies now contemplate more stakeholders. Of course, shareholders are included, but not only shareholders, other stakeholders are included. The decision-making process of companies that are indeed engaged in the ESG agenda, they do contemplate clients, suppliers, collaborators, the environment, peers, governments, and so on. Companies that do have this regard and this corporate culture are those that are indeed engaged in the ESG agenda. When we think of ESG, many people make two mistakes, which are very common. First is to think of ESG as a product, when in fact ESG is a process. A company cannot be rated as adhering or not to ESG principles because of the products they produce or of the services that they provide. Or the industry they're active. So we have renewable energy companies, for instance, and electric car companies that do not adhere to ESG. On the other hand, it's possible to have companies that are in sectors that have nothing to do with the ESG agenda, and however, they might have good practices. So ESG is about processes, is about responsibility, ethics towards all stakeholders involved. So we sort of have to remove some myths that ESG is only connected to one specific sector. There's also something I wanted to mention, is that there's a dichotomy between responsibility and profitability. Many people think that by choosing the path of responsibility, we are letting go of profitability, right? Which is quite the opposite, actually. This is not a true notion. Companies are noticing that when they choose to be responsible, they are also choosing the path of profitability. So ESG companies or companies that do have good practices and a good corporate culture, they wake up every day in the morning thinking how they could be better, larger, more profitable, increasing their margins and so forth. Some people believe that they are companies that are just spending a lot of money, that they're not concerned about generating results, which is not the case. And throughout this debate, we could give you many examples. But I think this is a common mistake that people make. We need a real perspective about the subject. From my perspective as an investor, and I'm about to finish, I search for companies that do have a long-term perspective, that make decisions based on stakeholders and that are responsible for what's external to them as well. Companies that do understand the negative impact that they generate for the ecosystem in which they are inserted and try to reduce these impacts. And therefore, these companies can look into the long term and generate more value also for shareholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fabio. We certainly have lots of questions for you later, but I'll change the order and invite Matthew to talk now.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you all and to be part of this great panel. And thank you to my other panelists for his opening remarks. I couldn't agree with a lot of what he was saying. I absolutely, echo a lot of what he was going over. And so I just want to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing in Plug and Play and some of the work that we've been specifically doing in sustainability, especially as it pertains to Latin America. So I am the Global Director of Sustainability at Plug and Play. I've been with the company for the last 3 years, but I've actually been in sustainability for the last 10. Yes, we are seeing kind of the rise of sustainability becoming more popular in the last year or so, but it's really been around for much, much longer. And I could not agree more with my other panelists. When it becomes a trend, it becomes a little bit dangerous. So one of the things we actually try to do, especially what I try to do, is reduce a lot of the myths that are out there when it comes to sustainability, reduce a lot of the hurdles, reduce a lot of the misconceptions, because when you remove that, then there's a lot of great value when it comes to working with startups and corporations in helping boost up sustainability efforts. So a little bit about Plug and Play. We are a global innovation platform. We currently operate across 38 locations around the world, working with thousands and thousands of startups in our ecosystem. To date, we have over 65,000 startups in our ecosystem, working across 18 different industry verticals, including healthcare and sustainability. But we also have food and beverage, ag tech, financial services, insurance services, cryptocurrency, and many, many other ones. We also do a lot of work with corporate innovation, and we do investments as well. So Plug and Play started as a VC firm with some pretty early investments such as PayPal, Google, Logitech, Dropbox, SoundHound, and one of our more recent unicorns that you might be aware of is Rappi. We were one of the first investors in that company. So we have done about 2,000 investments around the world through our history. I actually oversee all the investments in sustainability on behalf of Plug and Play, just given my background. And we also have been running accelerator programs all over the world, including in Latin America, or more specifically in Sao Paulo, with the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. So for our sustainability program, we have three major pillars. One is ending plastic waste around the world, where we are running programs currently in Silicon Valley, Paris, Shanghai, Singapore, Johannesburg, and as I mentioned, Sao Paulo. We also run programs in carbon neutrality and in sustainable fashion in all these locations. One of the benefits of having this global program is that we're able to work with startups locally and accelerate their growth and their pace of adoption and raising funds locally, and then help them scale globally. As well as we're able to also help solutions from other parts of the world come into the Sao Paulo and Latin American market. And we've seen tremendous, different types of technologies and business models, but I think more importantly, just passionate individuals that really want to make a difference. And so, we've been excited to work with all these startups, and we've been able to show you can invest into sustainability focused startups and make a profit. For VCs, we're very much focused on a return on our money that we deploy into startups. So, we've been able to show about a 3x ROI in 2 years from the 20 plus investments we've done in sustainability. So we've been able to show you can make money from it, and kind of remove that myth of you can only be sustainable or you can only make money, but you can't do both. And I can also not agree more with our other panelists, about sustainability is now at the C level. So one of the things that Plug and Play does is we work with over 500 organizations around the world, including many in Latin America. And we're actually helping them with their sustainability journeys, and it's coming from the C level. They want to do more for their local communities. They want to do more for the local environments, and not only make it environmentally sustainable, but also help people find jobs, help people get access to better healthcare, help people get access to better food and nutrition and better living conditions. So we've been able to work with a lot of amazing companies in this region, and helping them with their sustainability and innovation journey, and help them connect with fantastic startups that are really making a difference and impact in the world. And everywhere around the world, sustainability is treated differently. And so one thing we really try to do is shine a really focused light on new and exciting initiatives and reduce the hurdles and misconceptions and myths about sustainability, and help these startups and these corporations really boost their efforts and grow. And we're just here to be a great connector between all these different companies around the world and just move the entire space forward. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from a lot of you and your questions that you may have. For me, I've been working, as I mentioned, in this space for about 10 years. I've run my own company before. I've worked for the government before. I've worked for other VCs. So from those experiences, been able to learn a lot of the misconception and myths, but also how to solve those and tackle them. Because in order for us to really move the entire space forward when it comes to sustainability, it takes us all working together, and also working together with a clear vision and clear focus, and with a clear understanding of what the problem actually is and where we need to go in order to really solve it. So again, thank you to Amy for having me on this panel, and for the other panelists for their time. And I'm really looking forward to a great discussion today.
Thank you. We're still waiting for Viviane. She had some technical problems, so I'll start out by asking Matthew. Matthew, could you give us an example of a work that you did in Brazil? Could you give us an example of sustainability-related issues at Plug and Play?
Yes, so we actually ran a accelerator program for the Alliance to End Plastic Waste in Sao Paulo, where we accelerated about 12 startups from the region that were working on tackling plastic waste in the environment. So some did waste collection, some did advanced waste processing, finding end use markets for that plastic waste material. And we've helped set up different mechanical and chemical recycling facilities, not only in Sao Paulo, but actually in multiple parts of Latin America. One of the most recent ones was with a startup called Greenback and a company called Inval in Nestle, Mexico, where they're doing now chemical recycling of plastic waste material. Kind of stepping aside from plastic waste, we've also done quite a bit of work in carbon neutrality. But I think one of the more exciting ones, and ones that I've been personally very proud of, has been a company called Nihilus, where they're helping to prevent food waste or food from ending up in the landfill. So what they do is, people can sponsor food plates, and they will go provide those food plates to homeless shelters or to food banks. But they also work with corporations all throughout Latin America and really throughout the world. So if there is an issue on the packaging of a food, for instance, just it had the wrong label, or something where the food itself is perfectly good, they will actually prevent, instead of it being sent to a landfill, they will provide it to homeless shelters or food banks, or sell it on a secondary market for a fraction of the price that you would pay in a store. So it's providing clean, better nutrition. It's preventing food from going to the landfill and all this other material from going to the landfill, and getting it to the people that really need it. And they've also helped employ quite a few people from all over Latin America, specifically in Sao Paulo, that needed jobs. So it's been incredible to see the great work that they've been doing, and we're helping them grow even more. I'd say the last one has been a company called Agramo that we've been working with, where they are doing refill containers for different soaps or different things that you'd buy at your supermarket, but allowing everyday consumers to get bulk price even if they don't need that bulk material. So not only are they preventing more plastic waste, but they're also helping people get access to the everyday items that they need at a much cheaper price. And they are convenient because they will go to you, so you don't have to go to them. So they make it so it's very easy to access, and multiple people can utilize them. So not only have we been helping them grow and scale in Latin America, but we're also helping them grow in Europe, Southeast Asia, Africa, and North America.
Well, one interesting thing about these projects is this cross-sectionality between the different ESG related factors, both from a social standpoint and from an environmental perspective. These projects are all dealing with that, and we're going to talk about that moving forward. Now, my question to Fabio is there any sector or sectors that are uninvestable, so to speak, where you cannot invest from an ESG perspective? Is there any sector that you think goes against this idea of ESG and having a return on investments in the long term? Well, I love your question, Emmy, because it's provocative in the sense that, ESG is not binary. It's a quite complex thing. So my answer to you, whatever I answer to you, maybe Matthew could have an opposite opinion and we're both right. There's no absolute truth in ESG. There's different ways of looking at things, and that's fine. So I will give you what I clearly view as my personal opinion and what we do. And that's not necessarily, again, this is not necessarily a standard or the truth for ESG. That's my personal opinion. Well, what we think is the ESG concepts are, as I said, quite complex. So companies will potentially have some factors that are more or less advanced, and we're going to have to live with that. We won't find any perfect company in any way. And there's something else. With time, these things also change. The focus changes, the way the company deals with certain aspect changes, society changes. So it's not something static. It's not a static opinion. It's quite dynamic, actually. So in our opinion, there's only one ESG factor that's binary, and that to us is an excluding factor, which is ethics. There's no half ethics. You're either ethical or not ethical at all. So in that regard, that's where we draw the line. I would never invest in an anti-ethical company. With all other companies, I could invest in them with no problem at all, even if the ESG practices are not that strong. We can help them advance in that regard, and that's something that we usually do. We could invest in companies that are state of the art in terms of ESG practices, or we could invest in companies that are just starting their journey, and we can give them support. Where we don't invest at all is in companies that are not ethical in their practices. However, ethics is also an abstract concept. If I ask the panelists and everybody watching us what ethics means, probably we're going to get thousands of different answers. But in general, when I talk to Brazilians about what ethics is and what's not ethical, generally around here, the perception of ethics has to do with something that's has to do with finances. If they say that a company or somebody had a non-ethical behavior because they wanted to get some sort of financial benefit, our vision about ethics is it's broader than that. It's not only about finances. A company or an individual that mistreats human beings, or a person that segregates human beings, to me is unethical. A company that produces products that are harmful to society is unethical. A company that pollutes excessively and is not concerned about that is also unethical. So even if the commercial practices are ethical and licit in that they do not do tax evasion, do not do bribery, if the company is not anti-racist or anti-homophobic, or if they're disrespectful in terms of climate change, for instance, that to me is an unethical company. So that's complicated. When we see that that's a dogma for the company that is hard to overcome for them, to us, that becomes an uninvestable company. There's one additional aspect. There are some industries where, even though companies are responsible in how they operate, these industries go in the opposite direction of the rest of the world. I'm going to give you an example. The fossil fuels, for instance, or mining industries. Although there are companies that are doing all that in the right way, in a responsible way, these are industries that will start having to pay due to externalities, whereas they've never had to do that before. Carbon, for instance, is already regulated in 70% of the global GDP. It's not yet regulated over here in Brazil, but that's just a matter of time. So if we factor into the calculation how much of these companies will have to become responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions, they'll probably continue to be responsible companies, but they'll be financially less viable than they are right now. I wouldn't say that they are on our exclusion list, but they would be excluded from our list of interests. That was very clear. Thank you. Matthew, you told me when we were getting ready to start the panel that plug and play, you also go to large companies and go inside these large companies to improve their sustainability profile. Could you tell us a little bit about that, about where you see the biggest gap between what would be ideal and what you actually find in large corporations?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to kind of say I completely agree with my panelists. One thing we actually really try to do is bring startups that can shine in add transparency to a lot of these organizations or industries to show if they are being ethical or if they're not being ethical. And this has to do with working conditions or their environmental impact. And that's one of the things we actually try to really invest into and bring into these larger organizations. And this can be through working conditions or transparency in the supply chain. It can also deal with conflict material to make sure it's not a conflict material, or to make sure it's coming from it's ethically sourced as well. Some of the ways that we've been working with these larger organizations is how they're approaching their plastic waste footprint, their carbon footprint, their water footprint, and finding solutions for them to reduce those footprints overall. And also, simultaneously showing them how they can make money by doing so. We don't want this to be something that's a cost burden for them, because it won't stay with the company. It won't really stick. But when you show them you can reduce your plastics, carbon, water footprint and emissions, and also make more money or save more money, then it becomes much more attractive to a lot of these larger organizations. And it does environmentally, impact their local areas where they are or where their plants are. So we do quite a lot of strategy work for them, and really looking at their products and their processes, looking at their different plants and facilities, and ways that we can find exciting startups to help make those areas much more sustainable and make them money or save them money. If it can do both, great. But it's usually either it makes them or it saves them more money.
Matt, you were talking about decarbonization, and it's unavoidable to also speak about COP26, which is just about to end in Scotland. And Fabio, I want you to comment on that in a minute. I just read your article in the newspaper. It's an excellent title, actually. Is there any specific takeaway from COP26 that we've just seen? It will be finalized today or tomorrow. Any learning, any special learnings, or any lessons that we should take, both companies, or was it more of the same in your opinion?
So for me,
is the question addressed to me? It's Matthew, go ahead.
So for me, it feels governments are really behind, and a lot of the demand for sustainability has really come from individuals and just everyday people saying that they want their governments, they want their corporations, they want everyone to really step up It feels like it's been more the kind of the younger generation that's been demanding it and really pushing it, and the governments are taking a long time to really catch up with it. It felt a little bit like the same for me. I wish there was more, and I wish there was also faster actions. I know it is very difficult to decarbonize a lot of these industries and a lot of these countries. It's very complex, but I just the pace of adoption needs to be much faster. I'm calling you from California, and for much of the year we are on fire. And it has to do a lot with climate change and what's happening. So for me, it's a personal issue because our skies are usually gray with smoke, and we have ash constantly coming down on us, and we've had to evacuate for fires on a regular basis. And so there needs to be a lot more urgency from the governments, and it really should not take them all coming together once a year for a conference to do something. It should be something that is regularly being done, and being done at a much faster pace. And I think they need to step up much more. We can applaud and congratulate them for the commitments that they've made in this latest COP. However, much more needs to be done, and so it's an applaud, but it's not an enthusiastic applaud. I know it's a little bit of a depressing answer, but it's my honest opinion on it.
And I think that Fabio shares your opinion. Fabio, would you like to comment? Well, Matthew, I think you might enjoy reading the article that was published, that I wrote and was published yesterday. I quite echo what you just said. Just yesterday, I had the privilege to be part of COP26 as a panelist in a session called Investor Agenda. And I did make some reflections connected to what you said. As to your question, Emmy, and being quite straightforward, I think that this COP conference specifically was different from previous COP conferences for many reasons. First, because last year we did not have one. We were in the pandemic. So the last COP took place in Madrid in 2019. And throughout these last 2 years, many things happened. The first thing, was the pandemic itself. And the pandemic, as a side effect of everything we had to face, the pandemic brought to the forefront two very important questions for a climate conference. First is the social perspective, both coming from governments and also from companies. In 2019, we might not have had such an acute perspective on people's well-being. Maybe in 2019, we were still a little bit more individualistic, whereas now there was an expectation that companies and countries would have a different regard, because of everything we went through. The second aspect, which is relevant, is science. Science gained a lot of relevance in the last 2 years, also because of the pandemic. Brazil, unfortunately, in a survey done before the pandemic, among all relevant countries, from a population perspective, we are the country that less respects science. Everything that was discussed throughout the last 2 years from the point of view of vaccines, of a pandemic and how to fight it, really shed a light in the importance of science. And this would have been an important topic for COP26. And there's still more. This COP26 is the COP where the US returned to the Paris Agreement. So Trump left the Paris Agreement. Biden did a campaign that focused a lot on the environmental agenda. And the US is a very important player. So the return of the US to this field is very important and was very important specifically for this COP conference. ESG did gain a very large dimension throughout the last 2 years, which is another point I wanted to mention. So COP was previously limited to specific audiences, and now the whole corporate world and the finance world are part of COP, and they pay more attention. In this specific edition of COP, I don't want to be very technical, but there's Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which regulates specifically the carbon market, the international carbon market. And in the last 2 years, this market gained a lot of relevance, the carbon market. So there was a huge expectation with this COP conference. Of course, the COP is not finished yet. We still have to wait. And there are many impacts that will come after the conference. But I fully agree with Matthew. I think that unfortunately, we see, the corporations and governments, particular interests are still prevailing when compared to collective interests. Companies and governments, sometimes they look at their own belly buttons, so to speak, instead of looking at a more global well-being, a more collective manner. So yes, we are still lagging in spite of the importance of this COP. I think that we were still somehow frustrated. But there are, I think, positive lessons. I believe there were 2 points, and this, I did not write about this in my article, but I wanted to mention this now. First, I think that the participation of the Gen Z was very relevant for me. I think this is emblematic. It's an iconic participation. And, I think this gives us hope for the next COP conferences. This generation is increasingly part of the debate. And this generation, throughout the next few years, they will become consumers. They will become corporate leaders. They will work on public policies. So with time, with Gen Z, I think that we will be able to better address these questions. And the second remark I wanted to make, which I think is important, this COP is a topic that was made clear, and I think it will also be present in future COP conferences, which is the concept of adaptation. So what are the social consequences of these COP conferences? My apologies, of climate change. What are the social consequences of climate change in terms of social inequality, and how can we face these questions? Climate racism, and so many other subjects that we have to debate beyond science itself. I'm talking about a more social perspective, which I think is key. Yes, of course. And this is what Matthew was talking about Nilos. When he told me about this, it really drew my attention, which is, the aspect concerning inequality, hunger, poverty. This is finally becoming a prevalent discussion. Our panel is about investments and ESG, and there's something that I wonder, and it's a question addressed to both of you. Do you see a possibility of maybe someday, maybe not in the far removed future, having a country that could be the aim of sanctions because the country violates ESG principles? I'm going to give you an example. Fabio has signed together, Fabio, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, but I believe Fabio has signed, together with many other investment managers, to adhere to ESG practices. They wrote letters to our government regarding this topic. We also have the Mercosur agreement and the EU as well, this agreement between the two bodies, and facing many obstacles to be approved precisely because of questions connected to the environment. So could we have countries, and maybe even Brazil, becoming an uninvestable country, or a country difficult to invest in if we don't improve in ESG? It's a question addressed to both of you. May I begin? Please go ahead. Well, regarding boycotts or sanctions, this is a very delicate subject, because we have to separate the government from the civil society. When there is a boycott to a country, at the end of the day, we are penalizing the civil society, and the civil society oftentimes supports ESG. So most of the Brazilian population wants the forest, the Amazon forest, to be standing, wants it to be respected, want the environment to be respected. So boycotting a whole country would be penalizing individuals. And I think we really have to reflect about this. But I'm not against boycotts or sanctions. I just think that it has to be very well targeted. Companies that don't have good practices, that deforestate, that violate human rights, they should be boycotted. But the boycott has to be targeted correctly. Otherwise, this is generalized and the debate is then hindered. Matt, would you like to comment?
Yes, very interesting question. So, and I really agree. You have to separate the government and a corporation. If you are to sanction a government and say, no more investments, I feel it will actually make things worse. Because one, it might lead to more greenwashing. But let's say the sanctions actually go through, that lack of investment, things will get worse in that area. When it's a corporation and people are boycotting them because they want them to become more sustainable, the corporation has the ability to reinvest its own money to make its company more sustainable. And we've actually already seen that type of pressure work, where everyday consumers are pushing companies to be more sustainable, and they're using their purchasing power to say, I'm going to buy things that are more sustainable from companies that are more ethical or more sustainable than I would other ones. And corporations are realizing that, and they are trying to adjust and change in real time. Not only that, but the people that want to work for those organizations are also demanding that those companies be more inclusive, be more ethical, be more sustainable. And so you're seeing this grassroots movement really take on some of the most powerful companies in the world and change their attitudes and change their boardrooms in some companies, change their CEOs, and really change the mandate in which these companies operate. So it's been incredible to see that. But I don't feel a sanction for a country is a good idea. I think it could be actually very catastrophic. But pressuring corporations, I think, has led to a lot of really good changes. And I know there's more to come. So we've seen that kind of evolution of pressure, or that ripple effect of pressure, where it's starting with everyday citizens and consumers, and then going to the corporations, and then governments are kind of realizing. So the pace of adoption is slow it's different for different organizations and different levels, but it's starting to reach the governments, and we're starting to see them react and make commitments, but it just needs to be much faster.
My last question is connected to something that you mentioned, which is a transition. This transition in companies and corporations. Fabio had also said this is a process, right? That being ESG is a process. What about the costs associated to this process? This is an ongoing debate. Okay, fine, we want companies to transform. There's a lot of demand for improvement. And even between different generations, of course, as you mentioned. But what are the costs? How can the company balance the costs involved in the process versus the opportunities that this process brings? I think I know what you're going to answer. It's a question to both of you, but I just wanted to hear your answer. Matt, if you'd like to begin, please.
Yeah. So for some companies, it's costing them more to not go down the sustainability, path than if they are to stay on their own path. We've seen the impact that climate change has had on a lot of different, cities and areas. But one way to think about this also is, for instance, insurance companies, financial institutions, chemical companies. A lot of these places are along the coast, and climate change is impacting them, and it's costing them a fortune in damages, but also to move facilities. And I mean, the fires in California were devastating for people, but also insurance companies. So for them, there's a big financial risk if they don't push for more and more sustainability. So sometimes it does cost more not to become more sustainable. And then for other organizations, it will save them money or also make them more money. So it's really investing in themselves. So it's not necessarily just, a money pit where money is being thrown at it to become more sustainable, but it's more of a reinvesting in themselves, and that will lead to them becoming more sustainable. So that's the way I would frame it.
Fabio, would you like to comment? I fully agree. I think that the cost of not doing anything is higher than the cost of doing or of acting, certainly. But there are other aspects I just wanted to add. First is that this false perception, this false idea that the ESG agenda of sustainability is an expensive agenda. That makes some small and medium-sized companies saying, no, I can't do this right now, only if I become a large company, which is not true. There are many actions that are free and that people can take. So distributing a text about racism or homophobia, that's free, or keeping using more natural lights and avoiding or decreasing your energy consumption. This is free. Fostering the use of public transportation or bikes, recycling garbage, this is free. So there's no reason why small and medium-sized companies and large companies as well, there are many actions that can be done, and they are costless, and collectively, if applied collectively, they will have a great impact. So it's important to be aware of that, and maybe to demystify this idea that being sustainable is expensive. First, I need to grow as a company, and then I'll become sustainable. And there is another aspect that we have to take into account, in my opinion. I believe that companies are increasingly changing the way they understand their role. Until recently, companies believed that their responsibility was limited to the gates of the factory. So they would sell a product, and after I sell the product, the responsibility is not mine anymore. The responsibility lies in the hands of the retailer or the distributor or the end consumer. And I think that the understanding has changed. People understand that the company is responsible for the whole chain, from suppliers, even outsourced suppliers, third parties or fourth parties, until the final destination. And this tends to lead to a more circular economy. I think that companies are increasingly understanding the dimension of their responsibilities. In this sense, there's another thing connected, which is advocacy. Until recently, companies that did not take a stance regarding important subjects for society, they were seen as neutral. Now, if you're a company and you don't take a stand, you were seeing that you're shying away from the debate. So you have to take a stand. Companies do have to take a stance, even if it's not part of their activity. Companies need to talk about democracy, about racism. Companies need to talk about climate change and so forth. Regarding the risks, or otherwise they will not be able to attract talent anymore. Gen Zers, they do not want to work for companies that do not have a dialogue about these values. So not having the ESG agenda also brings the risk of not attracting talent. And if you don't attract talent, you're damaging your own company. It's not an option anymore. And if you start to doing the math and you say, well, it's a cost, and if you're doing it, if that's your reasoning, you're not looking into the invisible costs. You know, the fact that your product might not be accepted, or that your company ceases to attract talent, and so forth. So we have to look at these costs in a broader manner.
I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience has also learned from you. And I'd like to thank both Fabio and Matthew. Thank you very much. See you next time.